Welcome to Ground Rules, Employment Law Over Your Coffee Break. My name's Pam Howland, and I'm here today with Jennifer Walrath and Doug Plass, also of Idaho Employment Lawyers, and we have a special guest here today, Monica Frame with BPM. Monica has over 25 years of human resource experience with emerging and established U.S. and global businesses, and she's been an HR consultant with BPM for 6.5 years and currently manages a highly experienced team of HR, compensation, and talent consultants, where she utilizes her experience as a business partner and HR team leader to support clients of all sizes. So, Monica, tell us a little bit about BPM before we jump in the event our listeners aren't familiar with it and want to know a little bit more about BPM.
Sure. Thanks, Pam. Great to be here today. BPM is actually a CPA and accounting firm. We are in the top 35 of accounting firms in the U.S. We also have a global presence. I sit squarely on the advisory side, which is not a CPA, because I do not claim to be one, or an accountant, and really sitting in on the HR consulting side of things. So everything people related, and then we also have other advisory services as well, anything really back office that a company would need.
And so tell us a little bit about the area that you serve, because it's not just limited to Idaho. So we're Idaho Employment Lawyers, but we know that BPM has a wider reach than that. So when you're working with clients, give us an idea of the reach that BPM has.
Yeah, we are a national company in the US, all 50 states. We also have entities in Canada, in the UK. We just launched there as well. And we have presence in various different countries across Europe as well. In terms of the reach for our HR consulting, we have some international experience, but primarily we work within the 50 states. So our consultants are very well versed in all things HR for all 50 states in the US.
Perfect. And I know by talking to you previously that you have some clients in California, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, sure do.
Is that the bulk of where you have clients located?
I would say that the bulk of our clients have some presence in California, so maybe 1 or 2 employees, maybe they're headquartered there, and then they have employees in other areas as well. So usually there's some touch on California, but yeah, we're all across the map.
Perfect. So we're Idaho Employment Lawyers. We're not licensed in California, but we're always kind of fascinated by California just because of all the differences and the different things, that we know go on there that make that employment law arena a lot different than the one here. So we're talking today about HR trends, and we asked Monica to tell us about some of the trends she's seeing as an HR consultant and how those trends are impacting workplaces. I guess before we jump in, tell us a little bit about how the clients you're seeing operating in California, are there big differences, I take it, you're seeing there than what you see in Idaho?
I would say that in California, there's just the ever-changing quick landscape of employment law changes. So people don't get a lot of notice. Things are retroactive. We're seeing this on the federal level as well, as I'm sure you know. But in California in particular, there's various different requirements from an employment standpoint that happen even retroactively, or you have 30 days notice potentially. A lot more on the benefits side, sick leave, time off requirements, things of that nature.
Yeah, that's interesting. Here it's the opposite, right? We don't see a lot of laws impacting employers and employees, and sometimes that's good, sometimes it makes it more challenging, but that's interesting. So we've asked Monica to talk about some of the trends that she's seeing. She gave us a little list in advance, and the number one topic on HR trends is a focus on cost cutting. So tell us a little bit about what type of things you're seeing that indicate there's this new trend involving a focus on cost cutting.
Yeah, it is quite prevalent in all of our clients that we see, and most companies that I speak to as well, just around trying to, reduce headcount, reduce cost that that maybe management doesn't feel is necessary. So we're seeing a cost cutting on the benefit side of things as well. Definitely looking at restructuring of benefits, how that plays out to employees, which of course then leads to culture and communication to employees as well. So we're seeing a lot on that. We're actually seeing a reduction in headcount on the general and administrative side as well. So things in HR, administrative focus, maybe, sole individuals taking over multiple disciplines as well. So really focusing in, as there might be a fear of recession, and pressure on the cost side in terms of various different industries. We definitely are seeing this push towards, all right, how can we do this cheaper? How can we do it more efficiently? And, really just looking at every headcount.
Yeah. Jen, Doug, what are you guys seeing on this?
So I'm curious, are you hearing things about businesses cutting back on training, something that we are near and dear to our hearts here at Idaho Employment Lawyers, or is that something else that is not affected by these cost cutting?
I think it depends. It definitely depends in terms of what the training is on. Where you have required trainings, we're definitely seeing that more, or where you see prior risk, affected by prior risk. So if there was a former litigation issue, if someone has brought a claim, we definitely see a focus on training that way. I do think that there is always a hesitancy towards bringing things up to employees that maybe they wouldn't necessarily want to. So I think that everything is being looked at. And in some organizations, it really just depends on culture. But yeah, in some organizations, very clearly cutting back on anything they consider to be discretionary.
Well, I was going to ask, like you mentioned that some of your clients, you're seeing them try to take more creative approaches, maybe getting some of the same work done in more efficient or less costly ways. Are there any examples that come to mind of what those kinds of creative solutions are, or really just varies, I guess?
Yeah, I would say that on the benefit side, there's a lot that's really focused on trying to reduce overall cost and spend. In the last, I would say, I don't know, I would say 10 years ago, maybe, really the focus was on how do we beef up benefits? How do we make employees feel more, valued? How can we help with work-life balance? How can we help with family? Things like that. And we're now starting to see this trend of how can we raise higher deductibles? How can we reduce premiums? How can we try to, restructure kind of the benefits plans in general, going to unlimited PTO plans so that there isn't a liability on the books, things of that nature that tend to, kind of take that liability away from the organization's balance sheet for, and again, I'm not an accountant, said that from the beginning, but that's really the motivating factor there. We do find issues with that, especially in highly regulated states. And I know it's kind of on one of the topics is on leaves and how to manage those types of things. So there are challenges with going to a complete, unlimited PTO policy. So definitely something that is happening across the board and looking in all different areas.
That's actually really interesting. We did a podcast, a month ago maybe, on unlimited PTO and kind of talking through, even here in Idaho, maybe where it's not as highly regulated, but where employers still really want to think through if you're going to make that kind of a change and have that kind of a policy, some of the potential pitfalls and things to really think through if you're going to take that step. So that's really interesting that you're seeing an increase in that being a popular choice.
Yeah, what do you think of it? Just curious.
So I think that it can cause angst with employees. I think it can have an opposite effect to what companies or leaders are thinking that it will. So if, a CEO says, oh gosh, yes, you can have unlimited PTO, and then in their mind say, well, yes, but probably they should be taking about the same amount of PTO that they took previously. They can't really say that because it's considered unlimited PTO. So you can't give employees that indication, especially when you're looking at states that have mandatory payouts for vacation accruals and things of that nature. So there has been some litigation around that, specifically in California and New York. But we also see, just from an employee perspective, they start to question, wow, I'm not going to be able to take my vacation because it's not on my pay stub. It's not there. It's not a bank for me to use. So now the perception is my employer wants me to work more and I get less vacation. So it can actually have some very interesting effects just from a administrative on the leave of absence or communication standpoint. I think that in a lot of ways it becomes more difficult to help manage your workforce when you have an unlimited PTO policy.
Yeah, good points. We touched a little bit on some of those on our podcast about that, but it seems like it would be a great benefit, and then in reality, a lot of challenges with it for sure. I was going to touch on what you said about the possibility of headed into a recession, and are we, and how does that impact HR and employment law trends? And what I was going to note is that last week I was having a conversation with a group of professionals who work in this industry, and they were reporting some very interesting things. So one was a trend in employment law cases being filed, noting that there is an uptick right now in employment law lawsuits. There was an EEOC representative noting that here in Idaho, there's an uptick in Idaho Human Rights Commission complaints. And then we had some attorneys on that call too, who work representing employees, and they were noting just a general status of being at capacity. So those type of things would suggest to me anyway that there could be like some type of fear of recession or possible looming headed into a recession status that we're facing. From our perspective, when you're in a recession, it feels like employment law claims do go up because you have more people losing jobs, more people bringing claims based on reduction in forces, terminations, that type of stuff. So I would say what we're seeing is likely consistent with that too.
Yeah. One of the things that I notice as there is this fear, I've worked through a couple recessions, and what I find is that when you cut HR resources effectively in an organization, you tend to see those claims go up. So it's almost like it kind of ebbs and flows as well, because we can't get ahead of it, right? We can't say, hey, it's time to talk to the attorney. It's time to raise this. Maybe we should handle the situation differently. There isn't really that kind of oversight of those employment decisions ahead of time, less due diligence when you're talking about reductions in force as well. And I think there's, at least now, what I'm seeing, especially on some of the smaller employer side, is, companies saying, well, if it happens, it happens. If I get, I guess I'll deal with it if I get a claim, or I guess I'll deal with that if I get a lawsuit. And either that or they don't think it will ever happen to them. Something that you said was interesting that reminded me is, especially here in Idaho, we have the added piece of folks coming from other states where you do have higher wages, you do have higher regulation, you do have required mandated benefits in a lot of different areas that people are used to. And so then they come here and they realize, oh wait, I'm in a landscape where there really isn't a lot of things that the employer was required to provide to me. And so that mindset shifts, right, into, well, I might need to do something about this, right? Any little thing is going to raise a flag. So I think that it kind of lends itself to all together can create this perfect storm situation.
Yeah, for sure. We talk about that in our training and the need to stay on top of things for that exact reason, right? We're in Idaho. Maybe not a ton of regulation, maybe not a ton of law, but we do have a whole lot of people moving here from other states that do. And those employees might be a little more savvy on the employment law front and definitely bring with them higher expectations of what employers need to know about their compliance level, all of those things. That makes perfect sense. So let's shift gears a little. Let's keep making our way through Monica's HR trend list. The next item on the list is a dependency on AI. That is a trend that Monica is seeing. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's somewhat related to the cost cutting as well. I think that there is there's kind of a generalized mindset of, oh, well, if I don't need an actual person to do this function, right? I don't need an actual person to manage HR. AI can do all that for me. They go on to Chat GPT and they, put in a couple little keywords about, what it is that their organization is, what their challenges are, and it spits out, here's step one, step two, step three, right? I had a client just a few weeks ago that, we were noticing that they didn't have a handbook. They were a small organization. And one of the leaders went on to ChatGPT and said, draft me a simple handbook. And it came out as 4 pages with very, very minimal language in all of the required areas and a lot of required areas that weren't even touched on. And when you're dealing with cross state employment, right? So not necessarily just one state, not just necessarily just in Idaho or just in, California, for example, or Nevada or wherever, you have to keep those nuances in mind. And it's not something that AI has caught up with yet. So when we're seeing it, we're seeing, oh, well, ChatGPT told me this. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right way to approach it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the approach that AI brings is going to have that human aspect that you really need to pay attention to. At the end of the day, we're employing humans still. And so when you use a, computer to try to manage that, there's that human factor that you want to always take into consideration.
Yeah, Jen, Doug, what are you guys thinking about trends as far as dependency on AI or use of AI?
Well, I was just curious. You kind of mentioned, kind of people going to AI to maybe generate ideas or see if they can kind of replace some of these functions. Are you seeing that happening with like hiring or terminations? Like, are you seeing AI get used for that as well with your clients?
Oh, yes. And it can lead down some very scary paths, as I'm sure you can imagine. One of the things that HR professionals have in kind of ingrained in us is having that flag that goes, oh my gosh, this is not going well. We need to pivot. And I know that you all probably see that too in your lives when you're advising clients. It's something that AI cannot capture. When you're in the middle of a conversation and something is not being taken the right way, a termination conversation, for example, there is a innate human aspect that the other person doesn't want to feel like you're reading a script, right? They want to feel like you're having a person-to-person conversation. And when people don't feel treated fairly, especially in a termination situation, they start to question everything and they start to come up with their own reasons as to why the termination happened. Regardless if everything is, done according to the law and done in the right possible way, it doesn't mean that you're going to end up there in a good spot. Their mind goes elsewhere. Hiring is another thing that is a big piece around what AI is being used for, interview questions and things of that nature. Don't always take into consideration new requirements and new restrictions in certain states. So there are certain states right now, Idaho is not one of them, but there are certain states that limit what you can ask about prior employment in terms of, how much did you make in in your last job? You can't ask that in California and a couple other states. So things like that AI has not necessarily caught up with. It takes out that additional compliance factor that you just want to make sure you're keeping an eye on. So always wanting to gut check with an actual human what comes out of AI, in my opinion.
So, yeah, we've seen AI exploding everywhere. It seems to be everywhere in our society. But I'm wondering, from the employer perspective that you're working with, are you seeing employers training their staff on how to use AI, or is it more just kind of the Wild West and they're just kind of
Oh, it's a total Wild West.
Yeah,
Total Wild West. There is no training whatsoever. And, I think one of the things that they're just now catching up on is realizing that, when you're out on some of these open platforms, you're providing data back to AI, right? And so company information, confidential client information, if you're providing that back to ChatGPT, for example, you're going to be providing some issues. There's going to be issues there.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, because we do handbooks as well, and we've been adding in an AI policy, and there's different options that you can select, but kind of, I guess, prompting employers to think through that. Do you even allow employees to use AI? If you do, what are the limitations on it, right? Do you let them put any kind of information they want into any open platform? Can they only use certain platforms? And it sounds like maybe some employers are going through that exercise, but what I'm hearing from you is that maybe not as many as one might hope or think.
Yes, for sure. I would much prefer there to be, some sort of closed platform. It's more resources on the IT side as well, right? It requires more resources to develop things that are, develop a platform that employees can use that you're going to feel safe with. I'm always very careful. I mean, I use AI in certain situations, but you have to be very careful with it, and you have to know that you are checking what it's giving back to you and not just, saying, oh yeah, that's good, just send.
Yeah, we've seen some cases coming through where in the hiring process, some type of AI platform was used to screen candidates, and it turned out it was actually screening out people with disabilities, right? So I think we'll see more and more of that type of case law and guidance where it turns out there are a lot of problems with it. We actually have a podcast coming up sometime within the next few weeks on AI in the hiring process. I think we are seeing more and more guidance and information coming out on some best practices and problems with it. So that for sure is a good one to stay tuned with. And I like what you're saying too about, we all know AI is never going to replace the human factor. And if there's anything that requires a human factor, it's the termination process, right? One of the most difficult conversations an employer is probably ever going to have is telling someone why and the logistics of how they're going to be separated from the company, and showing up with a script that has no leeway for adaptation based on what's going on real time seems like a huge problem. Yeah, and we're seeing that locally too. I've had clients call and say, we're moving forward. Can you help us with the talking points? And then they'll say, actually, you don't need to. Like, I got it all through AI. I'm like, okay, be careful with that, right? Because some things just aren't going to be replaced by AI. And that one is so ripe with, risk looming in the background. You want to make sure you've thought through all the pieces of that.
Yeah, all I was going to throw on there is that I think it's fair to say that a lot of claims that we see coming through our office, a common thread is that the person just doesn't understand or doesn't believe, right, the reason why they're being terminated, or there's some other sense of unfairness, right? And all of those things potentially are things that could happen if you were relying too heavily on AI. Obviously, it could still happen even if AI is not in the picture, but I think what we've seen supports the notion that, at least minimizing risk will include having some sort of human element in there to read faces, see what the demeanor is, answer questions, and be able to be a little flexible and reactive to the person during that discussion.
Yeah, kind of a real world example that comes to mind, and I've seen this happen time and time again. So this isn't one individual person or case, but this is something that I see happen consistently, and I've seen it for my entire career, is that a manager is in a termination conversation and they have their bullets, right? Because, you should always have an idea of what you're going to say in that conversation. And the employee throws something out that they don't have an answer to in the bullet. So if there is such a heavy dependence upon these bullets, these talking points that AI has now provided, the manager is not prepared to pivot, right? And if nobody else is there, an attorney or HR is not there to try to help get in between that and adjust the conversation, the managers just start saying things that really should not be mentioned in that conversation. So as you're talking through, this position is being eliminated, and they're going, yes, but what about XYZ? then the manager starts defending XYZ that really happened a year and a half ago and didn't have anything to do with what we're talking about today. So trying to put such a heavy dependency on any other kind of script or, outside entity that's going to, say, oh, this is all I'm going to say and that's it, and then cut them short, it just creates or can create a lot more problems if they're not ready to pivot.
Yeah, that's a good example. And that's why, we say go in with bullet points for that exact reason, because people get sidetracked. It is so emotional, right? Or likely to be. So if you go in with bullets to just help you stay on track, but you still have to be, you have to know your guardrails for sure.
I was just thinking as you were talking, because I've seen a lot of employees using AI for their communications with their employer. We could have a future where it's just AIs talking to each other.
Bunch of computers sitting in a room having a conversation. You're like, catch me up later.
Okay, let's move on to another topic. That's some good info, but let's move on to a totally different topic. One that is near and dear to our heart, I feel like, because this is a big part of our practice, but it's leaves of absences and accommodation requests. Monica's got that on her list, and the trend she's seeing is that leave of absences and accommodation requests are increasing. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that this has been a trend, I would say, over the last maybe 5 years. I've seen it really ramp up, specifically in what I would call non-traditional accommodation requests specifically, and leave of absence requests. So, we tend to see a lot more around mental health questions, a lot more stress leave of absence claims, people even claiming workers' comp for stress claims, and mental health and kind of what work is doing to their mental health. And then, just coming in and just saying, I'm requesting a leave of absence because of this. And a lot of times there isn't necessarily a medical background or a medical note, so to speak, to state that this is really an accommodation that I need, which causes a whole nother set of questions of how do we handle this situation? Are we going to allow this leave of absence? Or folks that haven't been with the company long enough to qualify for FMLA. And so now you're sitting in a place of how do I respond to this employee who obviously has an issue, can't necessarily ask a lot of questions around where that issue came from or shouldn't. And any additional details around that. And then, navigating that is just very difficult for employers to do, because it just feels like, well, if they can't come to work, they should just not be here anymore. And once someone goes down this path of leave of absence and accommodation requests, you start to fall into, obviously disability claims and things of that nature, which I know you all are very well aware of and deal with all the time. But definitely seeing more, especially, even physical leave of absence requests and things of that nature, even if they're not work related, we're seeing a huge uptick in that, and longer leaves of absence as well. So a multitude of things that are changing.
As you were talking, I was just thinking about how some of these mental health and stress related issues are some of the most difficult. And, I do wonder sometimes, I think it's easy for employers to sort of brush off. Oh, well, you're stressed at work. That's the gig, right? Work is stressful. So kind of what's your problem? And I think, to some degree that's sort of a human reaction, right? Especially if you're sitting here in your job and you're stressed every day, it's difficult to empathize with somebody. But from a compliance perspective, and we talk about this all the time with respect to ADA, like don't do things based on assumptions, presumptions. And there are going to be situations where you do have to go through like an ADA interactive process. And there are some employers too who actually do have policies in their handbooks that say you can request some sort of, unpaid leave, and it's discretionary whether it gets provided or not. But there are policies out there or handbooks out there that have policies like that, all of which suggest take a moment and think about it. And, I do think it's just easy sometimes for people not to do that. So it's an interesting interesting observation that you're seeing that happening so much more, because that suggests that employers need to kind of devote some more resources, maybe to even getting even more up to speed on these issues at a high level, or at least enough to flag when that kind of discussion or evaluation needs to be happening.
Yeah, for sure. That stress question is an interesting one, right? Like, is stress a disability, right? Maybe not, but what if someone then takes it a step further and says, well, my doctor actually says I'm depressed because of, then maybe you have crossed into ADA land. And we tell employers all the time, your supervisors need to know enough to spot the issue, flag it, get it to HR so that it can be handled appropriately. You just can't really dabble in that one. And we do. The depression, PTSD, anxiety, stress, for sure. Those we see all the time, and they're not always easy to maneuver through. But you need to know somebody in-house who's got, the ability to take an issue and handle it in compliance with the ADA. But that only happens if the supervisors flag it and get it to the right person. I would note too that in some passing conversation with Ben Earwicker, I hope Ben doesn't care that I'm saying this. Hi, Ben, if you're listening. He's our Idaho Human Rights Commission director. He indicated that 2026, we might see some changes to our Idaho Human Rights Act on the disability front. I don't know that they're going to be extreme, but it sounded like maybe to get it, they had seen, some areas that might need squared up a little bit to make it consistent with the ADA. But that area is always changing and it is always evolving. And I don't think there's any reason to think that's going to change, right? So.
Yeah, and it kind of made me think too, Monica, you mentioned FMLA. And maybe you have employees who haven't qualified yet. And, here in Idaho too, we also have a number of employers who are private and small enough that they're not covered by FMLA. But I guess a little reminder for listeners, right, that these kinds of issues still need to be thought about, because even if you have up to 5 employees, you are covered by state law here in Idaho and have disability protections that are in place under the Idaho Human Rights Act. So definitely something to keep tabs on next year if there is legislative movement. But, even right now, right, employers with 5 or more have obligations with respect to employees with disabilities. So definitely something to keep track of, even if you're not covered by FMLA.
Yeah, anything else that you want to hit on before we close out? We've been chatting for about 30 minutes and want to give everybody a chance for some parting comments. Anything else as a takeaway or a parting comment that you think people should be thinking about when it comes to HR trends?
Yeah, I think that the biggest going away point that I would like listeners to walk away with is just making sure that you're always keeping in mind that human factor and how someone might react to whatever action that you're taking. Sometimes it's just a good idea to walk through that conversation and your thought process with somebody, right? And hopefully it's an internal HR department, employment lawyer, somebody that is going to talk you through and has experience knowing what might come of the situation. If you're talking about termination, you're talking about, hires, any redundancies that you're trying to maneuver, the AI conversations, leaves anything really in that human space. You just want to make sure that you're really thinking through how it might be received.
Yeah. Jen, Doug, any parting thoughts on HR trends?
No, I was just going to piggyback on what Monica was saying that, of course, we spend a lot of our time talking about and thinking about compliance, and that's a piece of what you were talking about. But also a large part of what we see is people's reactions to these kinds of discussions is often a driving force behind possible litigation or claims down the road. So I think what we see in our practice just confirms what Monica was saying.
Yeah, and that's often a question. That's often a question, whenever working through things with employers is, how do you think the employee is going to take this? And I think that's what you're getting at here, and I think that's a great way to thing to keep in mind in all of these.
Yeah, I love Monica, and Jen talked about it a little bit too. Think just the most basic concept of fairness, right? Like sometimes we think, okay, there's so many things to be thinking about when it comes to compliance, but really that fairness piece really is at the root of almost every employment law claim. So, if you're doing some kind of gut check before you're taking some kind of action, just think, does this look like we're fair? That goes to a lot of things, right? Like a little bit of notice. Does the employee know it's coming? Has somebody coached them? Are they going to be blindsided? All those things give somebody an impression of maybe not something being fair. So that really underlying concept of fairness is a big one. And I guess, my big takeaway is just some of the things we talk about all the time. Like a lot of this relates to your policies. Do you have the right policies? Don't just do the AI give me a handbook thing. Monica was talking about that a little bit. That's ripe for a lot of issues, especially if you've got offices in more than one state. Very dicey to do that. Are you keeping your handbook updated? Do you have the ADA policies you need? And then do you have the training you need? Are your supervisors and other leaders, are they up to speed on some of these big issues? Do they know how AI can cause claims and lawsuits? Do they know what to do if somebody's complaining of stress caused inability to do their work? Are they thinking about how a reduction in force can lead to claims and lawsuits? Are they thinking through the unlimited PTO issues? All of those things need some thought and planning, and your supervisors having enough training to know the basics to stay out of trouble. So that leads me to the little plug for our Law for Leaders book that we have. So in January, we published our Law for Leaders book, The Roadmap Every Leader Needs to Know to Avoid Workplace Claims and Lawsuits. Just thinking about what we were talking about today, we've got chapters 8, 9, 10, all dealt with the ADA. If you're listening to this thinking nobody in our workplace has the basic, ADA concepts or a basic ADA protocol, then you should be thinking about some training. And our book's an easy way to get that. We have our Law for Leaders training platform that covers a lot of these topics, right? We've got ADA is a big chunk of our recorded and live content, along with a lot of other, termination basics, why you need to document, a lot of the things that go to that concept of fairness that we touched on too. Let's see, we've got a lot of in-person appearances coming up in late August. And in September, we know we've got our SHRM conference. I think it's like the 19th, September 19th. We'll be there, be on the lookout for that. And we've got a workplace investigation training on September 25th. If you need some training on how to conduct your own in-house investigations, be thinking about that as well. So that's it for today on Ground Rules. Special thanks to Monica Frame of BPM for joining us today and sharing some insights. Monica, how can people reach you if they have more questions about your business or if they want to become connected with you on LinkedIn or otherwise?
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. So you can, our website is bpm.com, and you can go in there and just search for human resources consulting. Always connected on LinkedIn as well. I am very prevalent on there, all sorts of fun posts. And, through just contact me. I think that we can probably put my email address, hopefully, in any of this if anybody wants to contact me as well.
Yep.
Thanks
Perfect.
so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yep. Thanks for joining us.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.